The Watts family lived in a quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado, surrounded by the picturesque beauty of suburban life. Their house, a pristine two-story home with a neatly manicured lawn, stood as a testament to the American dream. Chris Watts, a seemingly devoted father and husband, worked long hours in the oil industry, while his wife, Shanann, a vivacious and ambitious entrepreneur, managed her successful business from home. Together, they raised their two daughters, Bella and Celeste, with love, laughter, and what appeared to be endless joy. To the outside world, the Watts family had it all. Shanann often shared snapshots of their lives on social media. Pictures of family trips, birthday celebrations, and candid moments with their girls filled her posts. "Chris is my rock," she wrote in one heartfelt caption. "I couldn't have asked for a better partner, father, or best friend." Her words painted a portrait of a life full of love and stability, a storybook existence that many envied. But Shanann's online life masked a growing unease. Behind closed doors, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Chris had grown distant, his warm demeanor replaced by a cold detachment that Shanann couldn't ignore. He no longer engaged in the playful banter that had once defined their relationship. Instead, his responses were curt, his attentiveness a mere shadow of what it used to be. Shanann confided in her closest friend, Nico Atkinson, during one of their frequent text exchanges. "He's not the same man," Shanann typed, her frustration palpable through the screen. "I don't know what's happening, but I feel like I'm losing him," Nicole, always supportive, reassured her. "Maybe he's just stressed. Talk to him, Shanann. You've always been good at pulling him back." Chris, however, was slipping further away. He had taken up late-night runs and extended his work hours, often claiming he was too tired to spend time with the family. Shanann noticed he had become glued to his phone, texting in hushed tones, and keeping his screen angled away from her view. When asked, he dismissed her concerns with a tired sigh and an all-too-casual, "It's just work stuff." Even the excitement of their upcoming baby, a boy they planned to name Nico, failed to rekindle the warmth between them. Shanann had once dreamed of growing old with Chris, raising their children together, and watching their family thrive. Now that dream felt fragile, like it could shatter with a single misstep. One evening, while Chris was in the shower, Shanann's curiosity overcame her. She unlocked his phone, a breach of trust that she instantly regretted but felt was necessary. As she scrolled through his messages, her stomach tightened. There were no explicit confessions, but there were signs, fragments of conversations, hidden calls, and a name, Nicole. Shanann didn't confront him immediately. Instead, she mulled over the fragments of evidence, unsure whether to trust her instincts or give Chris the benefit of the doubt. Deep down, she hoped she was wrong, that the man she had built her life with wasn't capable of betrayal. But the tension between them only grew, suffocating the once vibrant bond they shared. On August 12, 2018, Shanann packed her bags for a business trip, her mind racing with unanswered questions. As she kissed her daughters goodbye, she whispered promises of a better tomorrow, a tomorrow she was determined to fight for. Chris stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "We'll talk when you get back," she said, forcing a smile that felt more like a plea. Chris nodded, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her. "Yeah," he muttered, his tone hollow. Shanann's flight had barely touched the tarmac when Chris received a text from Nico Kessinger. The message was simple but electrifying for him. "I can't wait for us to finally be together." Chris stared at his phone, his lips curling into a faint smile. For a fleeting moment, the weight of his family obligations disappeared. In Nico, he saw freedom, an escape from the monotony of suburban life and the relentless expectations of fatherhood and marriage. He replied swiftly, "Soon." That evening, Chris tucked Bella and Celeste into bed, their small hands reaching out for hugs. "I love you, Daddy," Bella murmured sleepily. He held her close, her warmth momentarily piercing the armor he had built around his heart. But as he left their room, closing the door softly behind him, the walls of his mind began closing in. The text from Nico replayed in his head, blending with Shanann's recent accusations. "What are these charges, Chris? Who are you talking to?" she had demanded just days earlier. The confrontation had been a catalyst. Shanann's eyes, once full of trust, were now sharp with suspicion. Her voice carried a mix of anger and desperation, as though she were clinging to the last threads of their unraveling bond. Chris had dodged her questions, feigning innocence. "You're overthinking things, Shanann. It's work-related, that's all." But he knew she didn't believe him. Now, in the solitude of their bedroom, Chris unlocked his phone. He scrolled through photos of Nico, Her wide smile, her adventurous spirit, her promises of a life unburdened. His fingers hovered over the screen as a notification popped up. Shanann's friend Nicole had messaged her again. The reminder pulled him back to reality. Shanann was his wife, the mother of his children, but in that moment, she felt like an obstacle, a barrier standing between him and the life he thought he deserved. Shanann, meanwhile, had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Before leaving for her trip, she had started piecing together a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture. Credit card statements showed expensive dinners and flowers she never received. Chris's late-night absences, once attributed to long shifts at Anadarko Petroleum, were now glaring red flags. And then there was the change in his demeanor, his growing impatience, the way his phone was always turned away from her. Her fears coalesced into a single name, Nicole. She hadn't yet confronted Chris directly, but the evidence was mounting. A part of her still hoped she was wrong, that her imagination was running wild. But the Shanann of old, the hopeful, trusting wife, was giving way to a woman determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Back at work, Chris's double life began to fray. Colleagues noticed his unusual behavior, the distracted glances at his phone, the way his attention seemed to drift during conversations. He had always been reliable, steady, but now he seemed on edge, as though carrying a burden he couldn't share. Nicole, too, began to sense his unease. "Is everything okay?" she asked during one of their clandestine meetings. Chris nodded, forcing a smile. "It will be," he replied. But the cracks were starting to show. The tipping point came on the evening of August 11th. Shanann sent Chris a text that stopped him cold. "I don't feel safe anymore, Chris. I can't keep living like this." He stared at the message, his chest tightening. She was onto him. The life he had so carefully compartmentalized was beginning to collapse. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Guilt, anger, desperation. How had it come to this? That night, as the house lay silent, Chris sat alone in the darkened living room. His phone buzzed with another message from Nicole. "I need to know you're serious about us," it read. Chris clenched the phone in his hand, his knuckles white. A decision had to be made. His double life was unsustainable. Either he would find a way to reconcile the irreconcilable, or he would act decisively to rid himself of the conflict once and for all. When Shanann returned the next day, she was met with a version of Chris she barely recognized. His words were measured, his movements robotic. "We'll talk later," he said, brushing past her. Shanann's heart sank. Whatever was happening, she realized, was about to reach a breaking point. The tension in the Watts household was palpable as Shanann returned from her business trip. The late-night flight had left her exhausted, but it was the cold reception from Chris that truly drained her. She had hoped for a conversation, some semblance of reconciliation, but instead, she was met with indifference. Chris barely made eye contact, his responses clipped and mechanical. "We'll talk later," he muttered, brushing past her. Shanann felt a knot tighten in her chest, a mixture of frustration, fear, and a sinking realization that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Chris's detachment was even more glaring. He avoided Shanann altogether, focusing instead on the girls. Bella and Celeste, unaware of the storm brewing between their parents, clung to their father, vying for his attention. Shanann watched from the kitchen, her heart aching. She longed to pull him aside, to demand answers, but the weight of her suspicions held her back. How could she confront him when she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the truth? Later that day, Shanann confided in Nicole again, texting her furiously while Chris played with the girls in the backyard. "He's avoiding me," Shanann wrote. "He's here, but he's not really here. It's like he's already checked out." Nicole, ever the supportive friend, replied with a mix of concern and encouragement. "You need to talk to him, Shanann. You deserve to know what's going on." As the day wore on, Shanann tried to push past her fears. She cornered Chris in the living room after putting the girls down for their nap. "We need to talk," she said firmly, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Chris didn't look up from his phone. "About what?" he replied, his tone casual, almost dismissive. Shanann's frustration boiled over. "About us, Chris. About what's been going on with you. Why you've been so distant. Why you're always on your phone. Why you don't even look at me anymore." Chris finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was heavy with silence. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been stressed, Shanann. Work's been crazy, and honestly, I just need some space." Shanann shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Space? You've had nothing but space, Chris. I've been doing everything to hold this family together." and you're acting like none of it matters." The confrontation ended abruptly when Bella toddled into the room, rubbing her eyes and clutching her stuffed animal. "Mommy, why are you crying?" she asked softly. Shanann quickly wiped her tears, forcing a smile. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Go back to bed, okay?" Bella hesitated, looking at her father, who stood motionless, avoiding her gaze. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Chris knelt down, hugging her tightly. "It's okay, Bella. Everything's fine." But everything was far from fine. That night, Shanann lay awake, her mind racing. She replayed their conversation over and over, searching for answers in Chris's cryptic words. Meanwhile, Chris sat in the darkened kitchen staring at his phone. Nico's messages flashed on the screen, each one pulling him further away from the life he had built. "I can't wait for us to start over," one read. "I love you," said another. Chris felt the walls closing in, his two worlds colliding in a way he could no longer control. The following morning, Shanann decided she couldn't wait any longer. She approached Chris as he was preparing breakfast for the girls. "I want to know the truth, Chris," she said, her voice firm. "Are you seeing someone else?" Chris froze, his back to her. For a moment, the only sound was the sizzle of eggs in the pan. Then he turned, his face a mask of feigned innocence. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone defensive. But Shanann wasn't backing down. "Don't lie to me, Chris. I've seen the charges, the messages. I deserve to know the truth." Chris didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the stove, his grip tightening on the spatula. Shanann felt her stomach drop. His silence was more damning than any words could have been. The house was quiet, but the stillness was far from peaceful. It was the early hours of August 13th, 2018. Shanann had just returned from her business trip, her body heavy with exhaustion. She dropped her suitcase by the door, noticing the dim glow from the living room where Chris sat, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up as she entered, his face illuminated by the screen. "Chris," she called softly, but there was no response. Her voice, though quiet, carried an edge of frustration. "We need to talk, now." Chris finally set his phone down, his movements deliberate and slow. He leaned back on the couch, his eyes shadowed with something Shanann couldn't quite place. She sat across from him, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "What's going on with you, with us?" she asked, her tone more pleading than she intended. Chris didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a long sigh, his gaze fixed somewhere past her. "I don't think this is working anymore," he said finally, his voice low but steady. The words hit Shanann like a punch to the gut. She blinked, her mind scrambling to process what she just heard. "What do you mean?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. "I mean, I'm not happy. I haven't been for a long time," Chris replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "I think we should separate." Shanann felt her pulse quicken, a mix of anger and heartbreak surging through her. "Separate? Chris, we have a family. I'm pregnant with your son. How can you just throw all of that away?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. Chris rubbed his temples as if her words were nothing more than an inconvenience. "I've thought about this for a while, Shanann. I'm sorry, but it's what I want." Shanann stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. "You're lying," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "This isn't just about us, it's about her, isn't it? Nicole, don't even try to deny it. I know." Chris's face twitched, his composure cracking ever so slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "I know enough," Shanann snapped. Her voice echoed in the quiet house, carrying a weight that hung in the air. "You're going to ruin everything for someone who doesn't even care about this family. How could you do this to us, to Bella and Cece, to Nico?" The mention of their children seemed to strike a nerve. Chris stood abruptly, his towering frame suddenly menacing. "Don't bring the kids into this," he said, his voice sharp. But Shanann didn't back down. "They're already in it, Chris. You put them in it the moment you decided to live this double life." The argument escalated, their voices rising as years of resentment and betrayal spilled out. Shanann's tears flowed freely now, her words a mix of anger and desperation. Chris, however, seemed to grow colder with every passing second, his responses clipped and devoid of remorse. "Fine," Shanann said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what you want, we're done. But I'm taking the kids, Chris. You won't have them. You won't have any of us." Those words seemed to shatter something inside him. Chris's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're not taking them," he said, his voice eerily calm. Shanann didn't reply. She turned to leave the room, her heart pounding in her chest, but she never made it upstairs. Chris followed her, his movements swift and silent. The tension that had simmered for weeks, months, years finally erupted in a single irreversible act. He grabbed her from behind, his hands tightening around her neck. Shanann struggled, her hands clawing at his arms, her eyes wide with shock and fear. But Chris didn't stop. He couldn't stop. When it was over, the house fell silent once more. Chris stepped back, his chest heaving, his mind racing. Shanann's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, her eyes staring at nothing. For a moment, he simply stood there, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of panic and resolve. Then from the top of the stairs came a small voice. "Daddy?" Bella's voice was soft, trembling with confusion. "What's wrong with Mommy?" Chris turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Bella stood clutching her stuffed animal, her big brown eyes filled with fear. "Mommy's sleeping," Chris said, his voice trembling. "Go back to bed, Bella." But Bella didn't move. "She's not sleeping," she said, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her toy tighter. "What did you do to Mommy?" Chris swallowed hard, his mind racing. His lies, his decisions, his actions, they had all led to this moment, and in that moment he made a choice that would haunt him forever. The early morning darkness enveloped the Watts household as Chris worked in silence. His mind was blank, as if it refused to register the gravity of what he had done. Shanann's lifeless body lay on the floor, an unbearable weight in more ways than one. Chris couldn't afford to stop and think, not now. There was no room for hesitation, no room for guilt. He had made his decision. There was no turning back. He retrieved a large sheet from the laundry room, his movements methodical. He wrapped Shanann's body tightly, ensuring no part of her was exposed. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to reconsider, but his mind was locked in a singular, chilling focus. Bella and Celeste were still asleep upstairs. He needed to act before they woke. But as he dragged Shanann's body down the stairs toward the garage, a small voice shattered the silence. "Daddy?" Bella's voice trembled, her soft footsteps approaching the edge of the stairs. Chris froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Bella," he said, turning to face her, his voice eerily calm. "Go back to bed." The little girl shook her head, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. "I heard something. Where's Mommy?" Her eyes darted to the sheet on the floor, her innocent mind unable to comprehend the horror before her. Chris crouched down, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mommy's not feeling well. She's resting. Let's go back to your room, okay?" He reached out to take her hand, but Bella hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "Is she okay?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Chris nodded, his grip tightening on her small hand. "She's fine, Bella. Let's go." Back in the bedroom, Celeste stirred as Chris guided Bella into her bed. "Shh, don't wake Cece," he murmured, tucking the blanket around Bella. "Daddy will take care of everything." But Bella wasn't convinced. Her wide, tear-filled eyes followed him as he left the room, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. Chris closed the door softly behind him, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He could feel her gaze even after the door shut. In the garage, Chris loaded Shanann's body into the back of his truck. The weight of her presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of the irreversible path he had chosen. He slammed the tailgate shut, leaning against it for a moment as his mind raced. He glanced at the clock. There was no time to waste. Chris returned to the house, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. As he entered the girls' room, Bella sat up, her small figure silhouetted in the dim light. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Chris's stomach churned, but he forced himself to speak. "Everything's okay, Bella. We're going on a little trip." "A trip?" Bella asked, confused. "Now?" "Yes, now," Chris replied, his tone clipped. He gently lifted Celeste from her bed, cradling her as she stirred but didn't wake. Bella hesitated, clutching her stuffed animal tightly before sliding off her bed to follow him. In the truck, Chris placed the girls in the back seat, buckling them in as they rubbed their eyes and yawned. Bella looked out the window, her small hands clutching the edge of her seat. "Where's Mommy?" she asked again, her voice filled with worry. "She's at the doctor," Chris lied smoothly. "She'll meet us later." The drive to the oil field was silent, except for the occasional murmurs from Celeste, who had fallen back asleep. Bella, however, remained wide awake, her eyes darting between the darkened road ahead and her father's stoic profile. "Daddy," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Are we going to be okay?" Chris gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "Yes, Bella," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to be okay." But he knew that was a lie. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Watts driveway as Nicole Atkinson stood nervously outside Shanann's front door. She had been trying to reach Shanann for hours, but her calls and texts had gone unanswered. It wasn't like Shanann to be silent, especially with her meticulous schedule and the doctor's appointment she had planned. Something felt off, terribly off. Nicole knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing in the stillness of the neighborhood. "Shanann," she called, pressing her ear to the door. No response. Her pulse quickened as she stepped back, pulling out her phone to dial the police. "My friend is missing," she said urgently. "She's pregnant and has 2 small children. I'm really worried." Minutes later, a Frederick police officer arrived. Together, they approached the house, scanning the windows for signs of movement. Chris pulled up moments after, his truck rumbling to a halt. He stepped out, wearing a faintly puzzled expression that Nicole didn't buy for a second. "What's going on?" he asked casually, his hands tucked into his pockets. Nicole's voice was sharp. "Where's Shanann, Chris? She's not answering her phone and she missed her appointment." Chris shrugged, his calm demeanor unnerving. "I don't know. She said she was taking the girls to a friend's house. Maybe she just needed some space." Nicole narrowed her eyes, her gut telling her that something wasn't right. The officer, sensing the tension, intervened. "Mr. Watts, do you mind if we check inside?" Chris hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, let me unlock it." As the officer stepped into the house, Nicole followed closely behind, her eyes scanning every corner. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest. Shanann's purse sat on the counter, her phone next to it. Her medication, something she never left behind, was also there. Nicole's unease deepened. "She wouldn't leave without this," she said firmly, pointing at the items. Chris stood by the stairs, his posture stiff. "I told you she needed space." But even the officer was beginning to doubt his story. "Mr. Watts," he asked, "do you know if there's anywhere else she might have gone? A friend or family member she could be staying with?" Chris shook his head, avoiding eye contact. "No, not really. She doesn't have a lot of close friends here." As they continued to search, a neighbor approached. "You might want to see this," he said, motioning toward his house. The group followed him to his living room, where a security camera feed played on the screen. "This was early this morning," the neighbor said, pointing at the timestamp. The footage showed Chris's truck backing into the driveway around 5:15 a.m. He appeared to be loading something heavy into the bed. Nicole's breath caught. "What is that, Chris?" she demanded, her voice rising. Chris's expression hardened, his calm mask slipping just slightly. "Tools," he replied curtly. "I had an early job site today." The officer studied the footage, his brow furrowing. "That's a lot of activity for so early in the morning," he remarked. Chris crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I told you I was heading to work." Nicole couldn't hold back any longer. "You're lying," she snapped. "Where are Shanann and the girls? What did you do?" Chris's eyes flicked to her, then back to the officer. "I don't know what you're trying to imply," he said defensively. "I told you everything I know." The officer, sensing the rising tension, stepped in. "Mr. Watts, we'll need you to come down to the station for some follow-up questions. We're treating this as a missing persons case for now, but we need your cooperation." Chris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." As the officer led Chris outside, Nicole stood frozen, her mind racing. The man she had known for years suddenly felt like a stranger. The way he spoke, the way he moved, it all felt wrong. Deep down, she knew. Shanann and the girls weren't just missing. Something much darker was at play. The interrogation room felt oppressively small, its pale walls closing in as Chris sat at the metal table. Across from him, Detective Tammy Lee stared with quiet intensity, her gaze unwavering. "Chris," she began, her voice calm but deliberate. "We need to know everything. Where are Shanann and the girls?" Chris shifted in his chair, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where a camera silently recorded his every move. "I already told you," he said, his tone clipped. "I don't know. Shanann said she was taking the girls to a friend's house." Detective Lee leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "And yet," she countered, her voice soft but cutting, "her car is still in the garage. Her phone, her medication, everything she'd need is still at the house." "That doesn't make sense, Chris." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lee placed a sheet of paper in front of him. It was a printout from the neighbor's surveillance footage. Chris's truck, clearly visible, loaded and pulling out of the driveway at an odd hour. "Can you explain this?" Chris's jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffening. "I told you," he said through gritted teeth. "I was heading to a job site. I had tools to load." Tools? Lee asked, arching an eyebrow. At 5 in the morning? That's pretty early, even for someone in your line of work. She let the silence hang in the air, watching as Chris squirmed under the weight of her words. In another room, Nicole Kessinger sat nervously, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had come forward after seeing the news coverage, her initial confusion quickly morphing into horror. I didn't know he was still with her, she told detectives. He said they were separated, that the divorce was almost final. Her voice broke as she recounted their relationship, the texts, the promises of a new life together. I feel sick, she said, tears streaming down her face. If I had known, I never would have gotten involved. Detectives used Nicole's information to piece together a timeline, each revelation adding to the growing mountain of evidence against Chris. His phone records showed hours of conversations with Nicole, messages laced with affection and plans for the future. The stark contrast between his warm words to her and his cold demeanor toward his family painted a chilling picture of his double life. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Lee pushed a polygraph test toward Chris. If you're telling the truth, you have nothing to worry about, she said, her tone measured. Chris hesitated, his hand hovering over the consent form. Finally, he scribbled his name. The polygraph test was grueling, each question a knife twisting deeper into his fragile composure. Did you physically harm Shanann? Are you responsible for the disappearance of your daughters? The examiner's voice was calm, almost clinical, but each question carried the weight of accusation. Chris's answers came quickly. No, no, no. But his body betrayed him. When the test was over, Detective Lee re-entered the room, her expression unreadable. She placed a file on the table, flipping it open to reveal the results. Chris, she said, her voice quiet but firm, you failed. His face turned ashen, his composure crumbling as the walls of his lies began to close in. That's not possible, he stammered. The test must be wrong. It's not wrong, Lee replied, her voice steel-edged. The results are clear. You're not telling the truth. Chris's hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked away, his eyes fixed on a point in the corner of the room. It wasn't me, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Then tell us what happened, Lee pressed. Tell us the truth, Chris. The door opened and another detective entered, carrying a stack of files. We've retrieved the GPS data from your truck, he said, his tone flat. It shows you made an early morning trip to an oil field. Care to explain? Chris's shoulders slumped, the weight of the evidence crushing him. His carefully constructed web of lies had unraveled, leaving him exposed and defenseless. For a moment he sat in silence, his face pale and drawn. Finally, he exhaled shakily, his voice trembling as he spoke. Okay, he said, his eyes fixed on the table. I'll tell you what happened. The air in the interrogation room hung heavy with tension as Chris stared at the table, avoiding Detective Lee's piercing gaze. The dam holding back his secrets had cracked, and the truth was ready to flood out. His voice, low and trembling, broke the silence. It started with Shanann. Lee leaned forward, her expression unreadable, giving Chris the space to continue. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the table. She was angry. We argued. About the kids, about everything. She said she was taking them away, leaving me. His words came in halting bursts, as if each syllable physically hurt to utter. She told me I'd never see them again. The detective's face remained stoic, but her eyes stayed locked on him, observing every twitch, every hesitation. Chris inhaled sharply, his gaze darting to the corner of the room, where the camera silently recorded his confession. I lost control, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I strangled her. The room fell into a deafening silence. Chris's words lingered, their weight pressing down on everyone present, but Lee didn't let him off the hook. What about Bella and Celeste, she asked, her voice calm but firm. Chris flinched at the question, his jaw tightening. They were there, he said, his voice breaking. Bella came in. She saw... He couldn't finish the sentence. Tears streamed down his face, but there was no solace in his admission. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I took them all to the site. Detective Lee's eyes narrowed slightly, her professional composure unshaken despite the horror of what she was hearing. And then, she prompted. Chris clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. I smothered them, he admitted, his words a barely audible whisper. Cece first, then Bella. His voice cracked as he continued. Bella fought back. She said, Daddy, please don't do to me what you did to Cece. his face contorted in anguish as he relived the moment. "But I did." The confession was both horrifying and damning. Every detail Chris shared matched the growing mountain of evidence the detectives had painstakingly gathered. GPS data from his truck confirmed his trip to the oil field. The autopsy results would later corroborate his story in grim detail, leaving no room for doubt. Back at the oil site, investigators worked tirelessly to recover the bodies. Shanann was found buried in a shallow grave, her face bruised and swollen. Bella and Celeste were discovered submerged in separate oil tanks, their small, fragile bodies marred by the cruel reality of what had happened to them. The site left even the most seasoned officers shaken. News of Chris's confession spread quickly, sparking outrage and heartbreak throughout the community. The Watts family, once a symbol of suburban perfection, had become a grim cautionary tale. Shanann's family, devastated beyond words, issued a statement through their lawyer. "We trusted him, we loved him like a son, and he destroyed everything." As the public grappled with the unthinkable nature of Chris's actions, detectives pieced together the final pieces of his motive. Emails and text messages from Nico painted a clear picture of his double life. In one particularly damning exchange, Nico wrote, "I can't wait for us to finally start our lives together." It was clear that Chris had seen his family not as people, but as obstacles he believed he could simply remove. In the days that followed, Chris showed no signs of remorse. In court, he remained stoic, his eyes fixed forward as the charges were read. 4 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, tampering with a deceased human body. Each word echoed through the room, a grim reminder of the lives he had stolen. Detective Lee watched from the back of the courtroom, her mind replaying the haunting confession she had extracted. For all his tears and trembling words, Chris's true nature was evident. A man who had calculated every step, every lie, until there was no way out but the cold truth. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with faces etched in sorrow, disbelief, and anger. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras poised to capture every moment of what had become one of the most sensational trials in recent memory. Chris Watts sat at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of the horror he had unleashed. He showed no emotion, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, avoiding the glances of the grieving families behind him. The prosecution began by recounting the details of the murders, sparing no one from the grim reality of Chris's actions. "Chris Watts didn't just kill his family," the lead prosecutor declared, his voice steady but laced with righteous anger. "He betrayed them in the most unimaginable way. He planned their deaths, executed them without remorse, and discarded them like they were nothing." Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandy Rzucek, sat in the front row, clutching tissues in each other for support. Sandy's quiet sobs filled the room as the prosecutor displayed photos of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn Nico. Each image was a poignant reminder of the lives that had been stolen. The audience was silent, the weight of the evidence bearing down on everyone present. Chris's defense offered no fight. There was no argument, no counter-narrative. The evidence was overwhelming, and his confession had sealed his fate. His lawyer stood merely as a formality, ensuring that the judicial process was carried out correctly. Chris had pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, a decision that angered many but brought relief to the Rzucek family, who sought to avoid a prolonged trial. The most emotional moment of the trial came during the victim impact statements. Sandy stood, her voice trembling but resolute. She turned to face Chris, her gaze piercing. "You stole my daughter, my grandchildren, and my unborn grandson," she said, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to protect them, Chris. Instead, you destroyed them. And for what? Your own selfish desires?" Her words cut through the silence, each syllable a dagger. Frank followed, his voice choked with emotion. "Shanann loved you. She gave you everything. And you—" He paused, struggling to find the words. "You took it all away. You don't deserve to call yourself a father or a husband." In the gallery, whispers rippled through the crowd as Shanann's brother Frankie clenched his fists, his face a mask of fury. His anger was shared by many, a collective outrage at the coldness Chris displayed even now, as the truth of his actions was laid bare. The judge, a seasoned professional who had presided over countless criminal cases, took a moment to compose himself before delivering the sentence. "Christopher Watts," he began, his tone firm and unyielding, "your actions are beyond comprehension. You murdered your wife, your daughters, and your unborn son. You betrayed the trust of those who loved you most. For these heinous crimes, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words hung in the air, a final and irrevocable judgment. Chris remained motionless, his face devoid of any reaction. He didn't flinch as the courtroom erupted in quiet gasps and murmurs. For him, it seemed, the trial had ended long before today. The facade he had built, the doting father, the loving husband, was gone, replaced by the cold reality of his monstrous deeds. As Chris was escorted out in handcuffs, Sandy turned to the cameras, her voice shaking but firm. "We will never get our family back, but we will fight to ensure their memory lives on. This is not the end for Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico. Their light will never be extinguished." The trial had ended, but the scars it left behind would remain forever. The Watts family tragedy served as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the brightest smiles. The world would move on, but for those closest to Shanann, the fight to honor her legacy had only just begun. The courtroom had fallen silent, but the echoes of the trial reverberated far beyond its walls. The Watts family tragedy was no longer just a local horror. It had become a global conversation, sparking debates about domestic violence, hidden lives, and the fragility of trust. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico were gone, but their story left behind lessons that demanded to be learned. Sandy and Frank Razuchek, broken yet resilient, turned their pain into purpose. They established a foundation in Shanann's name, dedicated to raising awareness about the warning signs of domestic abuse and the importance of speaking out. "Shanann loved fiercely," Sandy said in an interview. "She gave everything to her family. If her story can help just one person, then her light hasn't gone out." The Foundation's work was a beacon for many who had suffered in silence. Victims shared their stories, drawing strength from Shanann's legacy. Her face, once a symbol of happiness and family, became a rallying cry for those who felt trapped, unseen, or unheard. "She taught us that appearances can be deceiving," one survivor wrote. "Her story showed me it's okay to ask for help." Chris Watts, now a convicted murderer serving life without parole, remained a shadow of the man he had once pretended to be. In the years following his sentencing, he granted occasional interviews, each more chilling than the last. "I don't know what I was thinking," he confessed in one. I thought I could start over." But his words rang hollow, offering no solace, no justification for the lives he had taken. The community of Frederick, Colorado, struggled to heal. The Watts home, once filled with laughter and the playful energy of Bella and Celeste, stood vacant, a haunting reminder of what had occurred there. Neighbors who had waved at Chris and Shanann from their driveways now looked at the house with a mix of sorrow and unease. "It's like the heart of our neighborhood is gone," one resident said. "It's something you can't forget." Shanann's social media posts, which had once showcased a picture-perfect life, were now revisited with a different lens. People scrutinized her videos and captions, searching for hidden signs of the turmoil beneath. In one particularly haunting post, Shanann had written, "No matter how tough life gets, hold on to the ones you love." The words, meant as encouragement, now felt like a plea. Experts in criminal psychology dissected Chris's actions, attempting to understand how a seemingly normal man could commit such unthinkable acts. They pointed to his double life, his growing resentment, and his inability to face the consequences of his choices. Chris Watts represents a rare but devastating phenomenon, one psychologist noted, the perfect storm of deceit, ego, and lack of empathy. But for all the analysis, the questions persisted. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Were there signs that were missed? Shanann's friends, family, and supporters revisited every memory, every conversation, searching for answers that might never come. Despite the pain, Shanann's family found ways to honor her and the children. Memorials were held each year, drawing hundreds who lit candles and released balloons in their memory. Bella's favorite song, "My Daddy is a Hero," once a cheerful tune she sang with pride, became a bittersweet refrain. "They deserved so much more," Sandy said during one vigil. "But we will keep their memory alive, always." In the end, the Watts family tragedy was a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. It challenged society to look closer, to ask harder questions, and to protect those who might be suffering in silence. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico were gone, but their legacy endured. A legacy of love, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The world moved on, but the lessons remained. For every heartbroken friend, Every grieving family member, every shocked neighbor, the tragedy of the Watts family was a story that would never be forgotten. It wasn't just a tale of loss, it was a call to action, a plea to see what lies beneath the surface, and a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable darkness, the light of love and memory can endure. What do you think of Chris Watts' actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartwarming and gripping tales by clicking here on the end screen.